national liberation movements in the colonies. Introduction. Even independent countries like China were actually under the control of numerous colonial powers and independent only in name. In this chapter, we will read about the plight of the colonies and how they began to fight against colonial domination of the European powers. China, two different phases. At the return of the 20th century, China was ruled by emperors of Manchu dynasty. The Western colonial powers had carved out their spheres of influence in different parts of China and had forced the emperors to give them economic and political concessions like low import taxes, immunity from Chinese laws, maintaining armed forces, etc. Both the common people and the administrators of the empire were unhappy with the state of affairs. There were several revolts by the people and attempts at reform by the administrators. Establishing the Republic. The Manchu Empire was overthrown and a republic established in 1911 under the Sun Yat-sen, who is regarded as the founder of modern China. He studied the problems of China and worked out a program of action. His program was called the Three Principles San Min Chui, which these were nationalism. This meant overthrowing the Manchu, who was seen democratic government. Nationalism. This meant overthrowing the Manchu, who were seen as a foreign dynasty, as well as other foreign imperialist democracy, or establishing democratic government and socialism, regulating industries and land reforms to redistribute land to the landless peasants. Even though Manchu dynasty was overthrown and a republic was declared, the republican government set by Sun Yat-sen could not consolidate itself. On 4th May 1919, an angry demonstration was held by Beijing to protest against the decisions of the Versailles Peace Conference. The protest became a movement called May 4th Movement. Revolutions carried for driving out foreigners who were controlling the country's resources to remove inequalities and reduce poverty. After the Republican Revolution, the country entered a period of turmoil. The Kuomintang KMT and the Chinese Communist Party emerged as a major forces striving to unite the country and bring stability. They identified the four great needs as clothing, food, housing, and transportation. After the death of Sun, Chiang Kai-shek emerged as a leader of Kuomintang. He sought to militarize the nation. The people, he said, must develop a habit of instinct or unified behavior. The Kuomintang's social base was in urban areas. Industrial growth was slow and limited. Urban workers, particularly women, earned very low wages. They were now organizing themselves into trade unions. As ideas of freedom became popular, there was growing concerns with women's rights, ways to build their family based on equality, and discussions about love and romance. Social and cultural changes was helped along by the spread and universities. Journalism flourished, reflecting the growing attractions of this new thinking. The Kuomintang, despite its attempts to unite the country, failed because of its narrow social base and limited political vision. A major plank of Sun Yat-sen's program regulating capital and equalizing land was never carried out because the party ignored the peasantry and the rising social inequalities. It sought to impose military order rather than address the problems faced by the people. The rise of the Communist Party of China. When the Japanese invaded China in 1937, the Kuomintang retreated. The long and the exhausting war weakened China. Rural China faced two crises. One, ecological, with soil exhaustion, deforestation and floods. And the second, a socio-economic one, caused the exploitative land tenure systems, indebtedness, primitive technology and poor communication. CCP had been founded in 1921, soon after the Russian Revolution. Mao Zedong, who emerged as a major CCP leader, took a different path by basing his revolutionary program on the peasantry. Millions of landless peasants joined the struggle led by CCP. His success made the CCP a powerful political force, ultimately won against the Kuomintang. A strong peasants' council Soviet was organized, united through confiscation and redistribution of land to landlords. He had become aware of women's problems and supported the emergency of Rural Women's Association. The Kuomintang blockade of the Communist Society forced the party to seek another base. Here, in their new base in Yanam, they further developed their program to end warlordism, carry out land reforms and fight foreign imperialism. This twin agenda of land reform and nationalization won them a strong social base. Japan attacked and occupied much of the China between 1937 and 1945. Both Kuomintang and CCP now tried to join forces to fight Japanese occupation. After the surrender of Japan to the US, August 1945, Kuomintang and CCP engaged with each other in all-out warfare for control over China. Eventually, CCP was successful in establishing its rule over mainland China, while Kuomintang was forced to set up its government on the island of Taiwan. Establishing the new democracy in 1949 and 1954, the People's Republic of China government was established in 1949. It was based on the principles of new democracy, an alliance of social classes opposed to landlordism and imperialism. Critical areas of the economy were put under government control. The land of Indian landlords and distributing them among poor peasants, the new government managed to enact laws to protect women, their rights and abolition of polygamy. Land reforms. After 2 years of relatively peace attempts at understanding rural situation, forming peasants associations, etc., land reform proper was launched in 1950-51. The major steps were a class identification of all village inhabitants, followed by the confiscation and redistribution of landlord land and other productive property. These methods subjected the landlords to public humiliation and the trials also resulted in execution of members of this class on the significant scale, perhaps 10 to 20 lakh individuals. As an economic reform program, land reform succeeded in redistributing about 43% of China's cultivated land to above 60% of the rural population. A massive effort for setting up adult peasant schools for spread literacy and political education was undertaken along with the land reforms. This was also accompanied by setting up of primary schools for both young children and adults in all the villages. It is generally agreed upon by scholars that the successful carrying out of the land reforms and universalization of education achieved in the initial years of the revolution formed a solid basis for future development of China. Vietnam against two colonizers. 3. The colonial experience. In mid-19th century, Vietnam came under the direct rule of the French. Exports, landlordism and peasants. The French were keen to develop Vietnam as an exporter of rice, and for these purposes they adopted a threefold strategy: improving irrigation network, encouraging landlords and facilitating marketing of agricultural produce like rice and rubber. The French began by building canals and draining lands in the Mekong Delta to increase cultivation. The vast system of irrigation works increased rice and allowed the export of rice to the international market. By 1931 had become the third largest exporter of rice in the world. This was followed by infrastructure projects to help transport goods for trade, move military rations and control the entire region. The colonial economy in Vietnam was primarily based on rice cultivation and rubber plantations owned by the French and few Vietnamese allied. In the rural areas, landlordism spread and large landlords took over the lands of small peasants and made them work as tenant farmers. As a result, the standard of living for the peasants declined. Decades of land expropriations and direct concessions to French colonists and the Vietnamese who sided with the French led to land being concentrated in the hands of large wealthy landlords. Statistics on landlessness and land ownership in 1930s offer a devastating general picture of the harsh conditions faced by the Vietnamese peasants. The peasants who returned the land of landlords had to pay rent in both share of produce and also by working on the fields and homes of the landlords, and also pay different kinds of taxes imposed by the landlords. This forced them to borrow rice and money from the landlords and pushed them further into debt bondage. The civilizing mission. The French colonizer, like the British, were convinced that the people of the colony were uncivilized and the objective of their rule was to bring the benefits of the modern civilization. Education was seen as one way to civilize the natives. The French needed an educated local labor force, by they feared that education might create problems. Even though Vietnamese language was taught in the primary level, all higher education was in French. Only the Vietnamese elite, comprising a small fraction of the population, could enroll in the schools. School textbooks glorified the French and justified colonial rule. Emergency of Vietnamese nationalism. Teachers and students did not blindly follow the curriculum given by the French. While teaching Vietnamese, teachers quietly modified the text and criticized what was stated. Students fought against the colonial government efforts to prevent the Vietnamese from qualifying for white-collar jobs. By the 1920s, students were forming various political parties such as Party of Young Annam and publishing nationalist journals such as Annamese Student. After the Republican Revolution of Sun Yat-sen in China, the Vietnamese too were inspired to establish a republican and democratic rule in Vietnam. The Great Depression of 1930s had a profound impact on Vietnam. The prices of rubber and rice fell, leading to rising rural debts, unemployment and rural uprising. The French put these uprisings down with great severity. In February 1913, Ho Chi Minh brought together competing nationalist groups to establish the Vietnamese Communist Party, later renamed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. In 1940, Japan occupied Vietnam as a part of imperial drive to control Southeast Asia, so the nationalists now had to fight against the Japanese as well as the French. The League for the Independence of Vietnam, which came to be known as Vietnam, fought the Japanese occupation and recaptured Hanoi. In September 1945. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam was formed and Ho Chi Minh became chairman. When the Vietnam came to power in August 1945, they immediately issued a circular for a 25% reduction in land rents, the cancellation of all the secondary rents. They also adopted the policy of redistributing communal land and land owned by French and Vietnamese traders. The New Republic of Vietnam. The new republic faced a number of challenges. The French tried to regain control by using the Emperor Bao Dai as their puppet. After 8 years of fight, the French were defeated in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu. In the pace of negotiations in Geneva that followed the French defeat, the Vietnamese were persuaded to accept the division of the country. North and South were split. Ho Chi Minh and the Communists took power in the North. The South was handed over to an old emperor who was soon ousted by the Ngo Dinh Diem. He built a repressive and authoritarian government. His dictatorial rule was opposed by the broad opposition, united under the banner of National Liberation Front (NLF). However, after 1954, a new era of land reforms was started in North Vietnam. This decisively won them the support of Vietnamese peasants whose long-cherished dream of earning their own land was now being fulfilled. The entity of US into the war. With the help of the Ho Chi Minh government in the north, the NLF fought for the unification of the country. The US watched these alliances with fear. Worried about the communists gaining power, it decided to intervene decisively, sending in troops and arms. US entry into the war marked a new phase that proved costly to the Vietnamese as well as to the Americans. This phase of struggle with the US was brutal. The widespread attacks and use of chemical weapons, Napalm, Agent Orange and phosphorus bombs destroyed many villages and decimated jungles. Civilians died in large numbers. US policy planner underestimated the power of the small country to fight the most technologically advanced country in the world. These peasants, inspired by nationalism and enthusiastic by the land reforms, played a most crucial role in defeating the mightiest army in the world. The effect of the war was felt within the US as well. The prolongation of the war created strong reactions even within the US. The widespread questioning of government policy strengthened moves to negotiate an end to the war. A peace settlement was signed in Paris in January 1974. This ended the conflict with the US, but fighting between the Saigon regime and the NLF continued. The NLF occupied the presidential palace in the Saigon 30 April 1975 and finally unified Vietnam. Nigeria forming unity against the colonizers, British colonialism and the making of a nation. The country we know as Nigeria today was actually created by the British by bringing together distinct regions inhabited by different tribal groups around the Niger River system. The region of the river Niger is one of the most populous countries of Africa, which has been suffering from the different kinds of colonial rule from the 16th century. It was a major source of slaves for America. With the abolition of the slave trade in 19th century, a new interest developed in trade in agricultural produce of this area, especially palm oil and cocoa. The British established their rule over the coastal areas in 1861 and developed Lagos as a major center of administration. The late 19th and early 20th centuries marked a resurgence of racism in the British colonial empire. Educated Africans were excluded from the civil services and African entrepreneurs were discriminated against. The colonial policy helped to promote modern education and administrative modernization in the South, while it followed the pre-modern tradition to continue in the world. This, over the century, created much regional disparity, and the North was not able to develop a modern educated social strata. In 1939, the British also separated the Yoruba and Igbo regions into the western and eastern Nigeria and encouraged the competition and conflict between the three major tribal groups so as to be able to divide and rule the country. In response to it, a section of Western educated intellectuals developed the idea of a common Nigerian nation and began to fight the British rule. Herbert Macaulay founded the Nigerian National Democratic Party (NNDP). In the 1930s, Macaulay also supported militant attacks on the British colonial government. In 1936, the Nigerian Youth Movement (NYM) was founded by Nnamdi Azikiwe. It applied to all the Nigerians regardless to cultural background and quickly grew to be the powerful political movement. In 1944, Macaulay and NYM leader Azikiwe agreed to form the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons of NCNC. Azikiwe increasingly became the dominant Nigerian nationalist leader. He supported Pan-Africanism and Pan-Nigerian based nationalist movement. independence and weak democracy. Considering the wave of nationalism, the British decided to hand over the power of the Nigerians and worked out of complex federal system which recognized autonomy of the three major regions. Nigeria became independent on 1st October 1963. Unfortunately, a just and democratic balance could not be worked out, and soon Nigeria slipped into a civil war and military rule which largely reinforced and domination of the north. Corruption and the suppression of human rights went hand in hand with the collaboration between the military regime and multinational oil corporation which funded the corrupt rulers. After a long haul of military dictatorship, Nigerians elected a democratic government in 1999. Oil, environment and politics. Oil was discovered in 1950s in the Niger Delta. Today, it is the most important resource of Nigeria. Most of the oil wells are owned by these corporations which have extracted Nigerian oil and shared part of its profits with the military rulers. Oil spillage from oil wells has a major impact on the ecosystem. Largely tracts of the mangrove forest which are especially susceptible to oil have been destroyed. An estimated 5 to 10% of Nigerian mangrove ecosystems have been wiped out either by clearing or oil spills destroy crops and aquaculture through contamination of the groundwater and soils. Drinking water is also frequently contaminated and a sheen of oil is visible in many local bodies of water. If the drinking water is contaminated, even if no immediate health effects are apparent, it can cause a long-term cancer. Offshore spills, which are usually much greater in scale, contaminated coastal environments and cause a decline in the local fish production. Throughout the early 1990s, popular unrest grew steadily, particularly in the Niger Delta region, where various ethnic groups began demanding compensation for years of ecological damage as well as control over their land oil resources. The situation came to a head and executed by the military government despite international protest. Thus, you can see that Nigeria is still making efforts to weld together a nation, work out a stable democratic system and gain control over its material resources.
మా వీడియో గనుక మీకు నచ్చినట్లయితే లైక్ చేయండి, షేర్ చేయండి. ఇలాంటి మరిన్ని వీడియోస్ కోసం మా ఛానల్ని సబ్స్క్రైబ్ చేసుకోవడం మాత్రం మర్చిపోకండి. థ్యాంక్ యూ ఫర్ వాచింగ్.